All right, everybody, welcome back to the show. Our guest today is Krystal Ball. She's the co-host of the popular YouTube show and podcast Breaking Points. Krystal Ball, great to see you.
Yeah, great to see you too. Thanks for having me on.
Interesting times, and I do feel like two weird things are happening. On one hand, you've got the Republicans who I don't know what Donald Trump's end game is, like with the tariffs. It seems like destined to try to do things that are going to be unpopular. By the same token, Democrats obviously have a lot of problems to deal with. Let's start off really broad. I mean, where do you see things as of almost April 1st?
That's really broad. Democratic Party is definitely a mess. They are floundering. I think they're being somewhat rescued by the fact that everything Trump is doing is like tailor-made to be wildly unpopular. Attacks on Social Security and giving tax cuts to billionaires in order to do cuts to Medicaid and escalating wars around the world and the tariff regime, which are as on again, off again, and seems sort of like tailor-made to cause a recession. So I think Democrats, probably in spite of themselves, are going to do well in midterms. I think they're going to do well in these special elections this week. Whether or not they can actually win in a Trump plus 30 district in Florida, I'm not sure about that. But the deeper question is, who is this party? What is this party all about? And what is their message and narrative of the world going to be going forward? And some of the post-election analysis about these issues, the set of issues on immigration or the set of issues on regarding transgender rights, like these things are unpopular. I think those things are true and fair to point out and worth debating, et cetera. But I think it sort of misses the point that the real problem for Democrats is that they did not have a story of the world that they could use to explain how things have gone sideways for working class voters. They did not have a story. They didn't have heroes. They didn't have villains. And so, Trump's narrative, which is like immigrants and cultural elites and trans people are destroying your towns and destroying your way of life, something is going to beat nothing every day of the week. And so to me, that's really the sort of central battle for the soul of the Democratic Party that is going to play out over the coming years. And right now, the central battle in the Democratic Party is just like, how much are you going to stand up and fight? And how much are you going to just sort of like go along and hope that Trump punches himself out, as James Carville sort of argues that they should do?
Right. And I guess one problem is, right, we're already having Elise Stefanik no longer going to be ambassador to the, what was it, UN. Now she's going to stay in her Pennsylvania seat because that Florida
New York
special election is so, too close for comfort. There's a Supreme Court race in Wisconsin. I mean, if things start going Democrats' ways and then it looks like they're going to have a great midterm, that could have the result of actually sort of reassuring them. Like, don't worry, you don't need to make any major changes. Everything's okay. So it seems like you believe that Democrats need to do some really big, deep work to like, who are they? What do they believe anymore? And actually, if things go too well for them too soon, electorally, maybe that gives them an excuse not to do that hard work.
I mean, I want them to do well electorally because I think that this administration is destroying the country in any manner of ways and, sending people to be tortured in a foreign gulag with no due process. And if there was at least some sort of check, that would be an improvement over the current situation. But I do think there's a risk of complacency. And listen, for myself, like, I want Democrats to be there because I want to check on this administration. But what I really care about is, how are you going to deliver for people? Like, how are you going to make people's lives better? How are you going to make it so that they can afford housing, so they can afford healthcare, so that they can have an aspiration that the future for their children is going to be better than, the life that they're living right now? And I think the core Democratic Party philosophy, which has been in many ways shared across both parties of neoliberalism, has run its course. To me, its benefits have always been a bit dubious, but whatever benefits were to be derived from that system have been extracted. So what does a new model look like that is capable of not just deferring to the market and assuming that businesses and oligarchs are going to do the right thing and it's all going to work out in the end? No, what are your values and how are you going to be able to effectuate that? And so, for me, obviously the electoral concerns, like, that matters, and how you talk about these things and the narratives and the way that it lands with people, those things matter. But what matters more to me is having an actual answer for people and an actual agenda that is going to improve working people's lives.
I want to simplify this. It'll help my understanding, and then you tell me if I'm right. So, obviously, during the FDR years, the FDR coalition, the Democratic Party was the party of the working man, and the
Mm-hmm.
Republican Party were at least cast as sort of the party of business interests, that kind of thing. And that lasted really up until Reagan and Reagan Bush were so successful electorally, and Democrats had lost so many, with Nixon, throw in Nixon, Democrats had lost so many elections that then Bill Clinton sort of reinvents the Democratic Party and co-opts a lot of Republican ideas. You might call them neoliberal ideas about free
Mm-hmm.
markets and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And that has really been, that has lasted. Now, what Trump has done is kind of outflank Democrats and rebrand the Republican Party now as being the party of the working class. That leaves the Democrats kind of out in the cold a little bit. But like, first off, that's a simplification, but like, is that a fair sort of, I don't know, assessment?
Yeah, I'll do my version of that. I mean,
Okay.
I think there was a New Deal era, right? And at the really FDR pushes into place. It's so powerful that Republicans, in many ways, also sort of adopt a New Deal era thinking. I mean, that's why you can go back and you're like, oh, Richard Nixon was the one who was behind the EPA because there was a sort of shared consensus. Eisenhower, similar thing.
Price
Then you
control
have,
too.
right,
Yeah.
exactly. And then when you get into the Carter era, Carter's kind of a transitional figure. He's got one foot in the New Deal era, but he also starts to bring in these pieces of trucking deregulation as one example. So he's starting to move on from the New Deal era. Reagan from the Republican side, and then it really is consolidated into place when Bill Clinton, to your point, is sort of like, I'm going to do tax cuts. I'm going to do deregulation. I'm going to end welfare as we know it. I'm going to do NAFTA. So then you have not that there weren't, debates and cultural issues that were, hot topics and all of those sorts of things and differences between the two parties. But by and large, they had a sort of like shared philosophy. Trump is offering a different approach that is, I think, proven out by this administration. I think it's a neo-fascist approach. I think it is I think it does center, the needs and desires of oligarchs. I think it is about using state power to crush any sort of dissent. That's what you see with like students being kidnapped off the street, with universities being brought to heel, with legal firms being brought to heel, with media organizations being brought to heel. That is his version. And I think there is a real danger that the Democratic Party does effectively the same thing that Bill Clinton did back in the 90s and is like, rather than trying to fight against that directly, we're going to do our own version of it. We're going to do like a kinder, gentler version of Trump's fascism because we think that's the easiest way to get back into electoral power. I think there is a real risk of that. Now, I would say that judging by the way that the Democratic base, not the elected officials, but by the way the Democratic base has reacted with so much energy and so much anger at the, plundering of our country and our democracy, that I think that it is unlikely at this point that they're going to fully go down that path. But exactly what the next flavor looks like is really undetermined. And I do think that even if Trump is so bad that they're able to win in the midterms, they're able to win in the next election. I mean, this is sort of like what happened with Biden. He's able to get in there, but you don't solve that core problem. You risk a long-term complete and utter meltdown. I mean, if you continue on this trajectory of working class Americans of all races shifting more and more to the right, of young people, Gen Z shifting to the right, then you're looking at a permanent minority party status. And to go back to your point about FDR and the New Deal, I mean, we don't have to look abroad to know how to fight sort of fascist and neo-fascist movements. I mean, fascism was never, have been many fascist elements of American politics throughout history, but it was sort of never more popular as a movement than just before FDR comes into power. Not to mention, obviously at the time we're fighting the Nazis overseas, et cetera. And his New Deal program of using the federal government to truly deliver on the fruits of democracy, that is the way to fight this movement that has such a lock on DC and on the country and, increasingly on the world right now.
Among his many gifts, and I'm sure that public policy was a part of it, but FDR also had this rhetorical ability and this charisma. I mean, it seems ridiculous to us, but people like it, he had that sort of mid-Atlantic voice or whatever they call it, but he actually, like, people were just enthralled by him and his radio voice. Um, isn't that a key missing component, right? Like, so the Democrats could come up with, do the hard work, do the therapy that they need, but they still would need a leader to ultimately embody that and present it.
Yeah, no doubt about it. I mean, I don't think you can ignore the power of charisma in presidential politics. And Trump has it in spades. Elon Musk, not so much, which is why I think his, popularity has fallen off a cliff here and around the world. But Trump is an incredibly charismatic figure. Barack Obama was an incredibly charismatic figure. Bill Clinton was a very charismatic figure. Bernie Sanders, in his
Mm-hmm.
oddball, curmudgeonly way, is a very compelling, charismatic character. And so, yeah, you have to have all of those pieces. You have to have someone who has credibility to sell people on, here's what we're going to do, and here's what it's going to look like, and here's what it's going to mean for your life, and who has that compelling ability to draw people into that vision. And certainly Kamala Harris didn't have really any of those pieces. And I mean, and also she was like hobbled from the start by this
Yeah.
late start and Joe Biden's legacy hanging over her and him still demanding that she not move an inch, no daylight between them, etc. But she was not the character to usher in, a real fulsome response to Trump and what his movement represents.
It seems like all the, kind of what we would consider to be mainstream liberal Democrats, right? The Gretchen Whitmers, the Gavin Newsoms, they just feel like politicians. And
Totally.
it seems like we're in an era now where the worst thing you can be is like a polished politician. And so Bernie and AOC, who've been having these rallies with, tens of thousands of people showing up, and they're obviously like on the left, kind of the populist left. And I don't necessarily agree with a lot of what they have to say. But they seem to have, like, they know what they believe, especially Bernie. And they do have that charisma. And even I would say, like, in the case of Bernie, it's not just charisma, it's like gravitas.
He's
It's like
commanding.
he knows who he is. He knows what he believes. He's been saying the same thing for 50 years or more, God knows more.
Mm-hmm.
Um, is that what, long wind up, but like, is that what the Democrats need? Like, will it be Bernie and Bernie AOC? Is he too old? What do you think?
I do think Bernie is too old, unfortunately, because listen, I mean, you look at every poll and he's like the most popular politician in the country. And, routinely has the highest favorability rating of any senator in the country, et cetera. In spite of many efforts, both on the right and the left, to demonize and caricature who he is and what he's all about. With regard to AOC, I have to be honest with you. I've been a little bit of an AOC hater, even though her politics in a lot of ways do align with mine. I was disappointed in, once she got into office, how she didn't maintain her sort of like rebellious outsider approach. She wanted to try to work on the inside. So I had a tactical difference with her. I also thought that she went too far in the direction of the sort of like, the off Latinx and birthing person and this like very academic, very woke language that I think was off-putting. And I always thought that that would really limit her ability to do much beyond like representing this congressional district in New York. I think at the time, I also thought it probably put even like a New York State run out of reach. But she has really impressed me, and I think many others, in this particular moment when there is a complete vacuum of leadership in the Democratic Party, when so many parts of society, to include Democratic Party leadership, are simply capitulating or trying to keep their head down. And I think she's been quite impressive in her courage to sort of just get out there and say what she thinks. And I also think her message has been very disciplined. She has been really focused, laser focused on this message around stopping oligarchy and delivering for working class people. And, that has earned her the respect of many just like normie Democratic Party types who would have previously been skeptical of a Bernie, would have previously been skeptical of an AOC. So, do I think she'll be the nominee? Do I think that she has what it takes to win a presidential election? We're a long way from there, but I will say I'm much more open to that idea than I would have been previously. And just one last thing to add to that, which I think is interesting and gets to what's going on within the Democratic Party base right now. They did a survey of the people who are showing up to these Bernie Stop Oligarchy rallies. And half of them are people who didn't support Bernie, who were not, they're not Bernie donors. They weren't Bernie voters, but they're just so happy to see someone who has a coherent message and who is out there fighting. And right now, that sense of like, oh, we just need somebody to get out there and fight, whether it's Jasmine Crockett or AOC or Bernie, it's really not particularly ideological, right? It's just like a vibe of like, you got to resist, you got to do something.
Yeah.
But I do think it's being noted that the people who predominantly are filling that vacuum are on the left and do have that ideology to fill in. So as I said before, a lot of this is going to, shake out in the 2028 primary and how that all goes down and what sort of characters enter that race. But like you mentioned, Gavin Newsom, I'm not a Newsom fan, and he's too corporate. He's done some good things in California from a progressive perspective, but whenever the interest of either Silicon Valley or Hollywood or Wall Street donors come up against the interest of working class people, you always know which side he's ultimately going to come down on. But I respected the fact that he has some formidable political skills and talents, which I thought were most on display in that debate that he did with Ron DeSantis on Fox News. Here's someone who goes in the lion's den against who was at that time the sort of like ascendant Republican darling, and he really handled himself well. He has really miscalculated in how he has handled this period by launching this podcast. And fine to have Charlie Kirk on, fine to have Steve Bannon on, but you're just going to sit there and tell them how cool they are and how much you respect them and how much you quote unquote appreciate them. Like, put aside how I feel about these characters who I think are incredibly odious and destructive to the country. Just as a political ploy, I cannot tell you how tone deaf that is for the Democratic base. I thought if he had on, let's say he had on Charlie Kirk and they did like a knockdown, drag out debate, it doesn't have to be ugly, but like, fierce, you've got values, you're sticking up for them. I think he could have done so much to cement himself as the likely Democratic nominee, and he's got all the money behind him, and he's got all the institutional support, et cetera. And many mainstream politicians have really, on the Democratic side, misread this moment and thought that the thing that they needed to do was to, cuddle up to their adversaries rather than demonstrate a way forward in an alternative view.
Totally. In that regard, it reminds me a little bit of 03, right? Where you had like Lieberman and folks like that not going hard against Bush, and Howard Dean shows up and says, I'm here to represent the left wing, the Democratic wing of the Democratic Party. I think he was an imperfect vessel ultimately as well, but he gained incredible momentum because he was willing to fight. And he was like, there was a hunger amongst the base for someone willing to stand up to Bush at that point when he was perceived to be super popular. You're talking about Gavin.
The thing it reminds me of is like a sort of inverse of the Republican Tea Party moment. And I actually ran for Congress in 2010, which didn't go all that well
Virginia,
for me.
right?
Yeah, in Virginia, exactly. But, it was a similar, it was a reaction against Obama, right? And in the same way, there's a huge reaction against Trump with the Democratic base now. But there was also disgust with Republican leadership. Mm-hmm. And that's what's so different this time versus the last time Trump was in office. At that point, the Democratic base felt like, oh my God, Nancy Pelosi, she's a queen, like Adam Schiff, these people are on our side, MSNBC, like, let's go, Morning Joe, Nicole Wallace, like, these are our people, and they're fighting the same fight that we are. And that gave those people, all of them, a lot of power with the Democratic base. It's not that way at all this time. There is so much disgust and disappointment with Democratic leadership and with media outlets like the Washington Post, New York Times, with, Joe and Mika making their little trek down to Mar-a-Lago. And so it really does have quite an analogous feeling to the Tea Party revolt of 2010, which of course, leads to a landslide in the House, leads to all of these intra-party primaries, leads to this, Freedom Caucus, which is always there, thorn in the side of Republican leadership, and ultimately is the energy that leads to Donald Trump's takeover of the Republican Party, even though ideologically you would think they don't really fit, but they actually were the sort of like precursor to that movement.
What do you make of people, other, I would say, kind of left-leaning progressive, populist progressives who went over to the MAGA side? It seems like there's quite a few kind of prominent populist progressives who embrace Trump because they like some of his policies. They like the tariffs. I mean, in many ways, Trump is like a 1980s Democrat, or he was actually a Democrat, right?
I don't buy
Were
that,
you
but go on.
were you ever tempted to go to the dark
No.
side? And what do you make of other people who have like looked the other way on the atrocities and just gone all in on the charisma?
I mean, his economic policy is for the rich and it's a disaster for working people. His primary accomplishment in his first term in office was a tax cut for the rich. He's handed the whole government effectively to the richest man on the planet to destroy Social Security. He's giving tax cuts to the rich again. He's slashing Medicaid. He's crashing the economy. I mean, I just know economically, I see this time around. Last time I would have said some different things about, okay, we're renegotiating NAFTA. Yes, even tariffs. I think I supported the tariffs that he did in his first term in office. 20% across the board tariff is just completely idiotic, destructive. Like, there is no world in which this causes anything but massive pain and is one of the largest, most regressive tax hikes in modern history that you can imagine. So no, nothing about his economic or foreign policy tempts me whatsoever. But to your point, I used to really sort of scoff at this idea of the Bernie to Trump pipeline because I think it was offered by a lot of people initially on the Democratic side in bad faith to be like, oh, well, these people are just like secret right wingers, right? And that is bullshit because Bernie's view of the world and Trump's view of the world are very, very distinct. But I do think there is an anti-establishment vibe that is appealing about Bernie and that is similarly appealing about Trump. So yeah, you have, and not just like influencers, whatever. Influencers are motivated by any number of like monetary or who was mean to them or who patted them on the head or whatever. But in terms of actual voters, you've seen that shift as well. I mean, think about what the knock was on both of Bernie's campaigns. So, oh, all these toxic Bernie bros, right? And this was always a smear. It was always a carrot. Bernie had plenty of women supporting him. He won, he was overwhelmingly winning Latinos among young voters. He was winning Black voters, et cetera. But that was the idea of like the bros are with Bernie. Well, the bros are now with Trump. And guess what? Maybe you should have offered a political movement that has some appeal to the bros. Maybe that wasn't such a bad thing that Bernie had appealed to those groups or the, Latinos who have increasingly moved to the right as well. So most people are not parsing all of the policies. They're looking at, they're like, what's the energy that's being put off? Who's in favor of upending the system that has been bad for me, bad for my life, has caused me this pain and misery? And who's for maintaining it? And so to me, a lot of the shift among the type of voters that you're talking about has come from that energy, more so maybe than any like particular policy outlook.
If Trump does these tariffs, which it looks like he will be doing April 2nd, we'll see. If it ends up costing 20-25% more to buy a car, if Canadian lumber makes the housing even less affordable for most Americans, if he gives another tax cut mainly to the rich, if your brother-in-law loses his job working for the government even though he voted for Trump, like all of these things. Do you think that there is a point where it's not just a backlash amongst the left, but that Trump, I don't know what, I assume that his ceiling or his basement is like 40%, but do you think that could this not just, a midterm route, which where every president almost has a bad midterm, but how ugly do you think this gets for Trump?
I mean, at his lowest after January 6th, I think his approval ratings were like in the 30s. And I think we're headed there. I mean, already his approval rating has fallen off. His approval rating is always like relatively low. They love to send out these things like, oh, Trump's approval rating it's high for him. And it's like he's only underwater by 3 points instead of 15 or whatever. But his approval rating is already beginning to slide. And we're still pretty early in the administration. So, in terms of the political risks for him, as much as I would love for people to focus, as I think, is important, on the people who were rounded up and with zero due process shipped to be tortured in a foreign country based on like whether an ICE agent liked their tattoo or not. I think the biggest political risk for him is tariffs and is the economy. Economics have always been his strength because people buy into that idea. Oh, he's a businessman. He must know what he's doing, right? And they had warm fuzzies about the economy under him from the first term. And that has already completely shifted. He is dramatically underwater in terms of his economic handling. And every bad thing that happens in the economy now, because he's been so active with the tariffs are on and they're off, and I'm doing all of these things, and Elon's, imposing austerity, he really at this point owns everything negative that happens in the economy. So, also with regard to the tariffs, in 2016, the economic landscape was very different than it is now. At that point, inflation was not a primary concern for voters. Now, voters overwhelmingly said that's not inflation. That's the number one reason that I voted for this man. And he's out there now saying, I couldn't care less if prices go up. Like,
the ads write themselves. They really do.
Yeah, I mean they do.
No pain, no gain.
Absolutely. So I think that, coupled with the spectacle of all of these billionaires that surround him, and of course the richest man on the planet, wrecking Social Security, coming for any number of popular programs, Meals on Wheels, pediatric cancer research. Yeah, I think it's politically a devastating landscape if he continues in this direction. And he seems very set on continuing in this direction.
But when I look at the authoritarian stuff that he's doing, right? Like rounding up immigrants, threatening. Actually, he's threatening if you vandalize a Tesla car, you could be a domestic terrorist and you could be sent to El Salvador, even if you're an American citizen born in America. So he says, leaning on basically shaking down law firms, like all of this stuff. I'm actually glad that he's about to wreck the economy. I hate to say that because I'll be impacted. We're all in this, but like, wouldn't it be super scary if Trump were like governing very responsibly with the economy and like really trying to bring down prices at the same time he was doing all of this? I mean, it could be the saving graces. I don't know why he thinks these tariffs are he must truly believe in them, is my only theory, because it seems stupid to me politically.
I have some darker theories about what could be going on here. Like, if you look at the 2008 financial crisis, if you look at the COVID crash, billionaires saw this as like a buying opportunity. They came out richer than ever out of both recessions. And, he's got a lot of billionaires around him who may look at an economic crash as like, this is an opportunity for me to buy the dip, buy low, and acquire even more assets. That's one theory. Another thing people floated is like, boy, you could really make a lot of money if you knew when he was going to make all these, like, the tariffs are on, the tariffs are off.
Yeah.
Kind of, if you had that sort of inside knowledge. Because, I mean, he has not even really explained consistently what his goal is with putting 20% tariffs across the board.
Look, if
if you want to reindustrialize the country, go ahead.
Yeah, like if he said to me, look, China is a problem, right? I mean, we have got to, for geopolitical national security purposes, we have got to. Or even if he just said, I don't necessarily agree with the whole bring back American manufacturing, theory. But if he said to me, this is of national security importance. Remember, we couldn't import masks during COVID because the supply chain, like we need to be producing a lot more. And so there is going to be pain, but I'm asking the American public to buy in. This is ultimately going to benefit Americans. I mean, you could hear, I don't know, Reagan or someone
Yeah.
eloquently explain it. I still may disagree. Maybe it still wouldn't make sense, but at least there'd be like a coherent ethos, right,
Hmm.
that we could defend. But as it is now, it's so, there's like 10 different reasons, and most of them are mutually exclusive.
That's exactly right. Yeah. My co-host Sagar is like wants to be in favor of these tariffs. And he's like, but what am I even arguing for? I don't know. Like I can't defend them because I don't even know what they're all about or what they would even do. So yeah. And I think the American public could be sold on targeted tariffs at China, a continuation of what Trump did in this first term, what Biden did actually more effectively because he paired it with industrial policy. And that's the other piece of this is like the research shows that tariffs alone, even if they're smartly targeted at key industries, et cetera, like let's say the auto industry, tariffs alone don't really do the job. You also need government investment and concerted industrial policy. And, it has to be, money has to be spent, it has to be organized, it has to be aggressive. Instead, he's going in the total opposite direction, ripping up actually the subsidies from the CHIPS Act, which was relatively successful, and also imposing austerity and government dysfunction through, Doge, which is not about efficiency. It's just about like gutting the administrative state so that they can't regulate Elon's companies anymore and so that he can hog up whatever contracts he wants to hog up and have more control over the federal government. So he's doing the opposite of what you would do strategically if you actually wanted to use these tariffs to reindustrialize the country. So instead, you're just going to make it so that prices are higher. I think there's a real danger at this point of stagflation. The
Yeah.
economic projections expect in the first quarter of this year GDP growth was only 0.3%. And so when you combine low or no growth with high inflation, which is the almost inevitable result of a massive tariff regime, you're going to get a load of just economic pain and disaster across the board.
And as I talked about with David from last week, I think it was, the problem then it becomes like a quagmire because the economic instruments you would use to get out of recession will worsen inflation. The
That's right.
things that you would do to get out of to lower inflation will worsen the recession. And so it becomes this vicious cycle, which I think, Reagan was able to finally break it in the early 80s, but it talk about going through pain. I mean, it was ugly for
Oh, yeah.
the American public for at least a year. I mean, after he imposed some of these policies. So, um, let me ask you, John Fetterman is an interesting character, right? This is somebody who was sort of seen as like a Bernie left wing kind of guy, populist guy. I mean, he sort of comes across like a working class everyman, whether that's authentic or not. He's got the great image. Recently, though, I've seen some buyer's remorse. I think it was AOC who was saying or implying that maybe Connor Lamb was actually the better pick.
Oh, no doubt.
Where are you on this?
Oh, 100%. 100%. I mean, the man cares more about like arming Israel to commit genocide in Gaza than he cares about Pennsylvania. What more do you need to know about him? He's a complete fraud in terms of how he sold himself on the campaign versus how he's actually governed. So, yeah, give me my Connor Lamb apology form. I will fill it out right here and now because, Fetterman is filling basically the role of like a mansion or a cinema at this point. And that is literally the polar opposite of how he ran. Like
Yeah, it's
he
weird, right?
ran, and I followed this campaign really closely. Democrats at the time were quite intentional about we don't want another Joe Manchin. And they were worried that Connor Lamb was going to be that guy. So, for Fetterman to come in and fill that role is the polar opposite of how he had positioned himself.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very pro-Israel myself, and and I was very um, happy with the direction Fetterman took. But it seems like since Trump took office, something else has been added to this. Where I think he went down to Mar-a-Lago, and sometimes he criticizes Trump, but it also seems like he's appeasing him in other cases. But do you have any idea? I mean,
100%.
obviously Fetterman had that stroke right before the you know I think it was, well, he ended up debating Dr. Oz after suffering the stroke, and it did not go well. But do you have any theories like what happened to Fetterman, why he's made this shift?
I mean, he said himself that the stroke changed his view on things. So I guess that might be it, but I don't know. I know that with regard to the Israel stuff, because Ryan Graham has done reporting on this, he in his campaign was just basically like, hey, AIPAC or whatever the group was, DMFI, Democratic Majority for Israel, that was playing in a lot of these primaries. He was basically like, just tell me what you want me to say and I'll say it.
Wow.
And so that's where, the Israel policy comes from. But in terms of the overall shift, I don't know. Sometimes it becomes personal because the left was so angry at him over his position on Israel. Then you just become like, well, these people are mean to me, so screw them. So I'm just going to take the opposite. I'm just going to like shut my brain off and take whatever the opposite position of. You see that far too often. And maybe that's the case with him. But
yeah, you become radicalized.
No,
I think my former boss, Tucker Carlson, after protesters showed up at his house in DC, it seemed like he did not respond well to that, and it may have impacted some of the subsequent things. What do you make of so I've been very interested in Ezra Klein's abundance theory, and I've to be honest with you, I've found it pretty compelling. It makes a lot of sense to me, but what do you think of it?
I think it's fine. I think it misses the most important dynamics in American politics, which are about inequality, corporate power, and oligarchy. And there was a kind of perfect example of this. So Ezra had this clip that went viral, Jon Stewart, like, oh my God, here's the 14 steps they have to do to get this rural broadband deployed. And it was like, oh, this is insane, right? And all sorts of environmental groups and whatever were being thrown under the bus for this. Well, you dig in and it turns out, actually, it was the internet service providers that wanted these regulations. And Democrats are corrupted by money in politics almost as much as Republicans are. But they, so they were okay with going along with putting these restrictions in to try to make sure that internet service providers weren't going to face any competition from this program. They also wanted to appeal to Republicans who also had these corporate interests. And so, doing the smart deregulation, making it easier to build. I think the part I really agree with is like focusing like a laser on actually delivering for people and getting things done. Yes to all of that. So, I mean, I just think that looking at regulations, good, let's do it, all for it. But you really have to deal with redistribution. You have to deal with inequality. You have to deal with oligarchy. Otherwise, you're just going to have, Elon Musk come in and run the government and do whatever the hell he wants at the expense of working class people, ultimately.
Yeah. And my guess is I think this is probably something that Ezra and his co-author have been thinking about for years. And I think it's relevant still, but in light of what Trump and Musk are doing right now, the context, maybe it's a little out of touch to focus on something else.
I think it's a little California centric. It's a little like, and Democrats win in California. They win in New York, they win in New York City. So it also strikes me as a little like California, New York, urban centric, and doesn't have much to say about the problems of, much of America, which has experienced deindustrialization and job loss thanks to bad trade deals and corporate power. So that's kind of my view.
Awesome. Well, Krystal, I could talk to you all day. I've got a million other questions, but we'll have you back. You have 1 million subscribers, so you don't need any plugs here, but why not? How can people keep up and get more Krystal Ball?
BreakingPoints.com. Free shows always available, and if you want to become a premium subscriber, you get the whole thing. You get it early, no ads, all that good stuff.
Awesome. Next time we talk, I want to delve into behind the scenes in your career and also your success going from mainstream media into what alternative media, new media. I don't know what the term of art is, but it's really cool, and everyone is going to be here on YouTube and Substack and all that. So you're doing a great job. Krystal Ball, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Matt. Great to chat with you.